Mengestu's first book was called The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears, or Les Choses que Porte le Ciel, and won acclaim for its depiction of the immigrant experience in the United States. It also won him a lot of critical praise and awards. He's selected as a winner of the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 5 Award, the 2008 Lannan Literary Fellowship, the Guardian's First Book Award in the UK, and in France, the Prix du Premier Roman Étranger. It was also one of the New York Times Book Review Notable Books of 2007 and one of Amazon.com's top 10 novels of the year. He also, as you may have seen advertised in our poster, was selected recently by The New Yorker as one of the 20 under 40 writers to watch. I'm actually reading the book that he's going to talk to you about tonight, How to Read the Air, right now. I can say it's a beautifully written book. I have lots of passages, as we've talked about, to be highlighted. And that's it. I hope you enjoy the reading, and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Vous avez le mic? No? Okay. Does that sound okay to everybody? Not too loud? Great. So thank you all very much for being here, and to the staff at the embassy and Regina in particular for all of your work in putting this together. I'm going to talk about this novel for a bit, and I think maybe also give you a general overview of my own history and biography. One of the strange things that often happens as a novelist is everyone wants to know what is actually real in your fiction, which makes me always want to say none of it is real because it's fiction, or the other half is that all of it is real because it's fiction, by which I mean I think part of the reason why we write is because fiction has a certain reality and truth to it that is necessary. This particular novel, and my first novel as well, definitely kind of draw on that idea of an immigrant narrative or an immigrant experience in the United States. But I'm always very skeptical and hesitant to call it an immigrant novel because the tradition of American literature and culture is a tradition of immigration. After my first novel was published, it was the first time I began seeing journalists or critics refer to me as an African writer, as an Ethiopian writer, or as an Ethiopian hyphenated American writer. And the more I thought about that, the more problematic I found that to be, because one, I've been raised in America since I was 2 years old, so I am fully and completely American regardless of where I live. And that doesn't exclude my own Ethiopian background or my family's heritage in Ethiopia. I've always thought that the joy and the benefit of having an American identity is that it has an expansiveness that allows room for all ethnicities, all identities, and all cultures to be American, but something is, I think, quite particular to the US. And so when I began this novel, I began semi-deliberately to open the story in Peoria, Illinois, which is where my family first emigrated to after we left Ethiopia, which is a very small, not very small, but it's a small town in the Midwest, and it's not the first destination of choice for most immigrants fleeing Africa. Maybe it is now these days, I don't quite know, I doubt it still. But my father left Ethiopia just before I was born because of the political revolution that happened in 1974. And he came to America before my mother and sister and I could join him, and he settled into Peoria, Illinois. And 2 years later, my family came and we all sort of began our kind of American experience. And I grew up never knowing anything about Ethiopia or Ethiopia's history and politics because so much of what happened during that time was violence, because my father lost family members during the revolution. He himself was sort of in danger. His brother, he was very close to, died during the revolution. And when we came to America, I think there was a sense that you can't translate that history into an American context for my parents. It was almost better to leave the past behind in order to begin a new life. But of course, as a child, you grow up curious as to who these people are, and you grow up curious as to what this identity behind you is supposed to be, this identity of being Ethiopian and being African and still in America. And yet you have no access to it because you're completely invested in the United States and because you're busy being a child and going to school and learning English. But as I grow older, I began to realize that, there's something about this history that was significant to my identity, something that I had to kind of come to terms with, and writing became that process. So the first novel I wrote tells the story of an Ethiopian immigrant older than myself by about a decade, who comes to America and opens a small grocery store. And it's a very experience completely unlike my own, where I came as a child. I've had the benefits of a nice education and everything. But as I began writing that novel, I began to realize a lot of the names in the novel were names of members of my family who had either died in the revolution or who were members of my family who I'd never known because they died after I left. And so bit by bit, as this novel began to grow, it ended up becoming an homage to these people and to these stories that were unknown to me because I could never see these people again. Or in some cases, I was able to see them again many years later. And writing, I realized, became a way for me to complete and fill this history. And so the second novel, as I said, began in Peoria, Illinois, which is where my own history began, but it really began to take shape after I went to Ethiopia for the first time, after 25 years. And I was the first person in my family to go to Ethiopia. I came back to America, and I decided right away I had to go to Peoria, Illinois to see this place, because I wanted to see how this country looked from the perspective of somebody coming from Ethiopia and coming from Africa, and to see if I could understand how you could try to become American, how that process begins. And so the novel opens with the narrator's father deciding he wants to drive through the Midwest because he feels like by doing so he can begin this journey towards an American identity, both for himself and for his wife, and because he wants to listen to country music, which is true actually in Ethiopia during the revolution. Oftentimes the only music you could hear in the West was country music, and country music was liked because people could understand the English, because they speak really slowly, which is something I sometimes fail to do. And other than that, the novel, I think, also tries very hard to argue for, I think what I'm saying earlier is that oftentimes we have to invent our histories. We don't always have access to truth. We don't always have access to the past, especially if that past is tainted by politics and tainted by violence. Oftentimes those realities interfere with our understanding of the way history has actually unfolded. And so narrative, creating stories, becomes, I think, one of the necessary tools that we have in order to understand both our own histories, but then also, I think, each other. The narrator of this novel spends a lot of time inventing a history for his father. He's a high school teacher, and he decides he wants to create for his students a new story about his father's migration out of Africa. And the story is by and large invented, and it's dependent upon the ability that, one, he can imagine history, and by imagining history, he can make it real. And two, in the belief that if he tells that story to somebody, that they will actually be able to feel compassion, that they will actually understand that story resembles their own life in some ways, because at the end of the day, whether we are immigrants or American-born or European or Algerian, we all have the same very small truths to our lives of life and death and love. And those divisions of immigration and color and race in the end all kind of fade away. They don't actually determine our identities as much as we think they do. But at the same time, we need to be able to try to understand our narratives and understand our histories, which is dependent upon that act of listening and that act of imagination. So that is the novel, my life, my philosophy, my politics in brief words. But I'm going to read for just a little bit from a part late in the novel. The narrator, as I said, has given up teaching his students a traditional class in literature. And instead he's decided that what he wants to tell them now, and what he's been telling them now for several weeks, is this story of his father's migration out of Africa through Europe and into America. And so this is near the end of that story. His father is in a tiny little village in Port Sudan. I'm sorry, not Port Sudan, since I made up the village, but a village that resembles Port Sudan in my imagination. And he's on his way onto a boat to come to Europe. I began my final lesson from where I had left off, with my father walking to the pier on his last morning with Abraham. They didn't say much along the way, but every now and then a few words slipped out. Abraham had important ideas that he wanted to express, but he had never known the exact words for them in any language. If he could have, he would have grabbed my father firmly by the wrist and held him there until he was certain that he understood just how much he depended on him and how much he had begun to hate him. To pin so much hope to a man seemed cruel and stupid. My father, meanwhile, was desperate to get away. He was terrified of boarding the ship, but he was more frightened of Abraham's desire. A man could easily be crushed under an obligation like that, and he felt himself being weighed down, as if his shoulders were slowly being loaded with stones as he waded into water. When they reached the pier, Abraham, who was my father's guide through the city, pointed to the last of the 3 boats docked in the harbor. "It's that boat," he said, "the one with the blue hull." My father stared at the boat for a long time and tried to imagine what it would be like to be buried inside of it, first for an hour, and then for a day. He didn't have the courage to imagine anything longer. The boat was old, but almost everything in the town was old. The cars, the tin roofs on most of the homes, the fabric that the men, women, and children wrapped themselves in, and then the very same men, women, and children themselves. All were engaged in a long-running state of gradual decay, one that may very well have been sustainable for as long, or perhaps even longer than a normal lifetime, as if the key to survival wasn't living well but dying slowly, in such gradual increments that actually death would pass you by altogether. There was a tall, light-skinned man at the end of the docks. He was from one of the Arab tribes in the north. Such men were common in town. They controlled most of its business and politics and had done so for centuries. They were traders, merchants, and sold anything or anyone. The effect was noticeable. They held themselves at a slight remove from other men, spotless white or on occasional pastel-colored robes that proved immune to the dust that covered every inch of the town. "He's arranged everything," Abraham told my father. "That man over there." My father tried to make out his face from where they were standing, but the man seemed to understand that they were talking about him and kept his head turned slightly away. The only feature that my father could make out was that of a rather abnormally long and narrow nose, a feature that seemed almost predatory in nature. Abraham handed my father a slip of yellow paper on which he had written something in Arabic. He handed him another piece of paper with an address and phone number in Khartoum, the capital. He understood that the first was for the man standing near the pier, and the latter for him, but he wasn't sure what to do with either letter. Did he fold them into his pockets, or did he clench them tightly in his fists?